The Arizona desert didn't keep secrets, it buried them. Under a sun that showed no mercy and a sky as vast and empty as a dead man's promise, the land stretched on, scorched and unforgiving. It was a place where life was measured in the space between one water source and the next, and silence was the only language that lasted. In the heart of this brutal quiet was the ranch of Jedediah, Jed Stone. But ranch was too generous a word. It was a fortress. A tomb he had built for himself with his own 2 hands, not to keep the world out, but to keep his ghosts in. For 8 years, Jed had been a ghost himself, a tall, hollowed-out man with eyes that had seen too much and hands calloused from work that was meant to numb, not build. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of someone who had learned that any wasted motion, any wasted word, was a debt you'd eventually have to pay. Each sunrise was a chore, each sunset a reprieve. He'd taught himself to ignore the heat, the dust, and the crushing loneliness. The only thing he couldn't ignore were the screams from Widow's Creek. They came to him in the dead of night, a phantom echo of gunfire and fear, a symphony of violence conducted by a devil he knew by name. And every morning, he'd wake up tasting ash in his mouth, the memory of failure clinging to him like a shroud. This night was no different. The moon hung like a sliver of bone in the black sky. Jed was cleaning his rifle on the porch, a ritual that was less about maintenance and more about keeping his hands busy, keeping his mind from wandering back down that blood-soaked canyon. That's when he saw it. A flicker of movement where none should be, a dark shape stumbling against the pale landscape. His body tensed instantly, the years of solitude sharpening his senses to a razor's edge. Coyote, maybe, or a stray steer. He reached for the rifle, his knuckles white. In this world, you shot first. Questions were a luxury for men who had neighbors to bury them, but it wasn't a coyote. As the figure staggered closer to the faint light spilling from his cabin, he saw the unmistakable silhouette of a person. They moved with a painful, lurching gait, a broken rhythm of desperation. Jed stood slowly, melting back into the shadows of the porch, the rifle held low but ready. He watched as the figure collapsed not 20 yards from his well, a heap of torn fabric and exhaustion. He waited. A minute passed, then another. No movement, no sound but the wind whispering through the sagebrush. Letting them die was the smart play, the safe play. Whoever they were bringing their trouble with them, and Jed had paid in blood for his peace. But as he stared, something pricked at the scar tissue around his heart. He cursed under his breath, a low, guttural sound of a man fighting a war with himself. With the rifle held loosely in one hand, he stepped off the porch, his boots making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As he drew closer, the moonlight revealed the truth. It was a woman, an Apache girl, couldn't be much older than 20. Her clothes were shredded, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt. A deep gash ran along her arm, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged whisper. But it was her eyes that held him. When he knelt, they fluttered open, and for a second they weren't broken, they were burning. A defiant, untamed fire that refused to be extinguished. She wasn't just a victim. She was a warrior who had simply run out of ground to fight on. Without a word, Jed holstered his rifle. He scooped her up, surprised by how little she weighed. She was all sinew and bone and will. She didn't fight, too weak to resist, but he could feel the tension in her small frame, the silent refusal to surrender. Inside his sparse cabin, he laid her gently on his own cot. He moved with a practiced efficiency, fetching water and clean rags. As he cleaned the wound on her arm, his fingers brushed against a small leather pouch tied to a cord around her neck, tucked inside her tunic. It was old, the leather worn smooth, and he could feel a strange, granular weight inside. The girl's eyes followed his every move, sharp and intelligent. She watched him, not with the fear of a captive, but with the careful assessment of a predator judging another. As he tied off the bandage, her hand, surprisingly strong, shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her eyes locked on his, and then darted down to the pouch. Her meaning was unmistakable. That is mine. That is everything. Jed nodded slowly. a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He understood. This wasn't just a possession, it was a purpose. He continued his work, giving her a sip of water, which she took with a desperate thirst. As he stood, he caught a glimpse of the intricate beadwork on the pouch, patterns he hadn't seen in years, patterns that spoke of a specific clan, a specific people. A people he knew Malachi Vane had been hunting. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over him. This wasn't just a random girl escaping a raid. She was a survivor of something far worse, and that pouch she was protecting with her last breath. It wasn't just a keepsake. It was a legacy. He realized with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that she was carrying the last hope of her tribe, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. He had spent 8 years building a wall around his soul. In a single night, a half-dead Apache girl had just kicked down the door. To help her was to invite the very hell he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. But to turn her out, to leave her to the desert and the wolves that walked on 2 legs, that was to finally pull the trigger on the man he used to be. He looked at the girl, at the fire still burning in her eyes, and made the decision that would change everything. He had just invited the devil to his doorstep. And Jedediah Stone knew, with the certainty of a man who'd seen hell firsthand, that Malachi Vane was coming to collect. If you're already hooked on Jed's story, type #1 in the comments and hit that subscribe button. Help us get to 1,000 subscribers and encourage us to keep bringing you these gripping Wild West tales. Now, let's see what happens when a man who wants nothing but peace is forced to confront his past. The fever took her just before dawn. It didn't creep in, it stormed the gates. One moment she was a watchful, wounded presence on his cot. The next, she was lost in a wildfire of shivering and fragmented whispers that filled the small cabin with a language of pain he didn't know, but understood perfectly. Jed worked with a grim, mechanical focus, a detached efficiency honed by years of tending to livestock, not people. He bathed her forehead with a damp cloth, the cool water turning warm against her skin almost instantly. He forced sips of water from the well between her cracked lips, most of it spilling down her chin. The small cabin, once his sanctuary of silence, was now filled with the sound of her labored breathing. Each rasping inhale was an accusation, each shuddering exhale a judgment. He hadn't been this close to another human being in 8 years. Hadn't felt the heat of their life, the fragile, thready pulse beneath their skin. He had forgotten the weight of it, the terrifying, undeniable responsibility. As he tended to her, the walls of his fortress began to crack, and the ghosts he'd kept locked away in the cellar of his soul slipped through the fissures. Her muttered words, sharp and guttural in a language he didn't understand, began to blend with the phantom screams from his memory until he could no longer tell them apart. He wasn't in his cabin anymore. He was back at Widow's Creek. The smell hit him first, the coppery tang of fresh blood mixing with the greasy smoke of burning pine and horsehair. He saw the face of the blacksmith's boy, no older than 10, his eyes wide with a question that would never be answered. He heard the splintering crash of an axe against a door and the high, thin scream of a woman that followed. These weren't vague memories. They were etchings, carved into the inside of his skull with a hot knife, and through the smoke and chaos, he saw him. Malachi Vane. The name tasted like rust and bile. Vane hadn't just led the massacre, he had orchestrated it like a maestro conducting a symphony of destruction. He moved through the violence, not with the wild rage of a killer, but with the cold, serene purpose of a reaper. Jed remembered Vane's eyes, pale blue, like chips of ice, as he stood over the blacksmith, wiping his saber clean on the man's shirt. God makes the sheep, Jedediah, Vane had said, his voice calm amidst the carnage. And he makes the wolves. It is a sin against nature for a wolf to pretend he is anything else. Jed had been one of Vane's wolves back then, a hired gun drawn in by good pay and Vane's twisted charisma. But he'd seen the truth too late. He had tried to stop it, tried to warn a family. It had cost him everything and saved no one. He had run, not from Vane's gun, but from the reflection of himself he saw in Vane's cold eyes. He ran from the wolf inside him, Now, the devil was coming back to claim his stray. Jed stood up abruptly, the damp rag falling from his hand. He backed away from the cot as if it were on fire, his breath catching in his throat. He paced the length of the small cabin, a caged animal whose world had just shrunk to the size of its own terror. Every instinct, sharpened by 8 years of survival, screamed at him to run. He could saddle his horse, Glory, take what little water and jerky he had, and be gone before the sun was high. Disappear deeper into the desert, find a new hole to crawl into. He could leave her there. Vane would find her, and the problem would be solved. It was the smart play, the survivor's play. He had survived this long by cutting every tie, by refusing to care. Caring was a noose you foolishly tied around your own neck and handed the rope to fate. He reached the cabin door and shoved it open, stepping out into the grey, pre-dawn light. The world was vast and empty. It would be so easy to just vanish, to let the desert reclaim this place and the ghosts within it. Let Vane have his prize, peace. It was all he'd wanted for 8 years. A quiet end, free from the screams. He took a step toward the stable, then another. His hand was almost on the latch, when the image of the girl's eyes, that defiant, unbroken fire, burned itself onto the back of his mind, and the weight of the small leather pouch he'd felt against her chest. Seeds. The last seeds of a slaughtered people. Vane wasn't just hunting a girl, he was hunting a future. He was a man who didn't just burn the house down, he salted the earth so nothing could ever grow there again. Damn it, Jed breathed, the word a harsh cloud of vapor in the cold air. His feet felt bolted to the ground. He owed the dead. He had owed them for 8 long years, a debt of cowardice that grew heavier with every sunrise. He couldn't pay back the lives lost at Widow's Creek. That ledger was written in blood and could never be balanced. But this girl, she wasn't the past. She was the present. She was a single flickering candle in the dark, and Vane was the wind coming to snuff it out. Handing her over wouldn't be peace. It would be complicity. It would be pulling the trigger himself. It would be the final, irrevocable proof that the ghost of Jedediah Stone had no soul left to save. The silence that fell then was different. It wasn't the calm of solitude. It was the heavy, charged quiet before a lightning strike. The air was thick with the coming storm, and for the first time in years, Jed didn't want to run from it. He felt a strange, cold resolve settle in his bones. It wasn't courage. Courage was for men who believed they could win. This was something else, acceptance. He turned his back on the stable, on the open desert, on the easy way out. He walked back into the cabin, his steps firm, resolute. He looked at Nayati, her body still fighting a war against the fever. He saw the pouch of seeds resting on her chest, a tiny emblem of defiance against a world determined to crush it. He was choosing to stand between that hope and the man who wanted to extinguish it. This wasn't a choice between life and death. He'd been dead for years. This was a choice between continuing to exist as a shadow, a hollow man haunted by ghosts, or standing up and becoming a man again, even if it was the last thing he ever did. Jed walked to the wall and took down his rifle. He didn't check it with the nervous energy of a man expecting a fight, but with the calm, methodical purpose of a man who had finally chosen his ground. The familiar metallic click of the chamber echoed in the charged stillness. He moved to the window, peering out at the horizon where the sun was beginning to bleed red across the sky. He wasn't looking for a way out anymore. He was watching for the devil's approach, and this time Jedediah Stone wouldn't be running. Jed is facing a choice that could get him killed. What would you do? Type number 2, inch the comments and let me know if you'd help her or run. And if you believe he's making the right choice, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and make sure you're subscribed, because the devil himself is about to come knocking. Let's watch what happens when he does. He didn't come with thunder and lightning. Malachi Vane arrived with the mid-morning sun, a lone rider appearing on the horizon, as if summoned from the shimmering heat itself. There was no war party, no posse of hired guns. There was only Vane, mounted on a jet-black stallion that moved with an unnatural grace, a beast as arrogant and predatory as its master. He didn't need an army. Vane's very presence was an invading force, an affliction upon the land he crossed. Jed saw him from the window, a dark speck growing steadily larger, and his gut tightened into a cold, hard knot. He didn't move. He just watched, his rifle leaning against the wall next to him, within easy reach. The fever had broken in the early hours, leaving Nayati weak but lucid. Her eyes, sharp and alert, were fixed on him now. She had heard the approaching hoofbeats. She knew. Jed gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Stay down. Stay quiet." Her expression hardened, a warrior's mask sliding into place. Vane rode directly to the cabin, dismounting with a fluid motion that was almost elegant. He didn't tether his horse. The animal simply stood, loyal and still as a statue. He adjusted the fine leather gloves on his hands, his movements unhurried, as if he were preparing for a Sunday social. He wore a long black duster, impeccably clean despite the desert, and a silver-buckled gun belt that held a pearl-handled Colt. He was a portrait of civilized menace, a rattlesnake dressed in silk. He didn't knock. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Vane filled the frame, blocking the blinding sunlight. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, a faint, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Jedediah," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone, yet carrying an edge that could strip flesh from bone. "I must confess, I never pictured you for the domestic type. Dirt floors and solitude always seemed more your style." He stepped inside, his spurs ringing softly on the floorboards. He moved with the entitled swagger of a man who believed the world was his property, and he was merely inspecting a dusty corner of it. His gaze swept the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the rifle against the wall, and finally settling on the figure on the cot. He saw Nayati, and his smile widened, a chilling display of triumph. "Ah," Vane breathed, a sound of profound satisfaction. "There she is, the little stray. Gave me quite the chase. She has more spirit than the rest of her kin, I'll give her that." Jed hadn't moved. He stood by the table, his body relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of flint. He was a coiled spring, and the tension in the room was so thick you could taste it. "She's not going anywhere, Malachi," Jed said, his voice low and even, a gravelly rumble that held no tremor of fear. Vane chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He took another step into the room, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. "Now, Jed, let's not be difficult. You and I, we have history, but business is business. That girl is loose property. I'm merely here to reclaim what's mine." "She's not property," Jed countered, his voice dropping even lower. "And she's not yours." Vane raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the defiance. "Is that so? And what, pray tell, makes you the arbiter of her fate? Did she wander into your benevolent protection? The great Jedediah Stone, savior of the downtrodden. It's a role that doesn't suit you, my friend. I remember a man who was far more pragmatic." The air crackled. This was the moment. The precipice. Jed had played this conversation 100 times in his mind in the last hour, searching for a path that didn't end in blood. He had found only one, a desperate, flimsy shield against a man who respected nothing but force. He took a slow breath, letting it out before he spoke. "She's my wife." The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by Nayati's sharp intake of breath from the cot. Even she hadn't seen this coming. For the first time, Vane's smirk faltered. His eyes narrowed, searching Jed's face for a flicker of a lie, a tell. He found nothing but unyielding resolve. The pale blue ice in his eyes began to harden. "Your wife?" he repeated, drawing the word out as if tasting something foul. "You would jest at a time like this, Jedediah." "No jest," Jed said flatly. "We were married by a traveling preacher 2 days ago, under the eyes of God and the law. She's Mrs. Stone now. And the law, even out here, says a man's wife is his own business. It was a lie so audacious, so utterly insane, that it almost sounded true. A shield made of paper against a cannonball. Jed could see the fury beginning to churn behind Vane's calm facade. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a cowering runaway, a broken man. He had not expected a challenge to his authority, wrapped in the sanctimonious cloak of civilization, the very laws he so often twisted to his own purpose. Vane's lips curled into a snarl. A preacher? In this wasteland? How very convenient. He took a menacing step closer to Jed, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You are a terrible liar, Jedediah, always were." "Maybe," Jed replied, not flinching. "But the U.S. Marshal out of Prescott isn't. He takes marriage vows seriously. You lay a hand on her, and you're not just dealing with me. You're dealing with him. You really want to bring that kind of heat down on yourself for one Apache girl." The bluff was all he had. It was a house of cards in a hurricane, but it was the only play. For a long, stretched-out moment, Vane said nothing. He stared at Jed, and Jed stared back, an immovable object meeting an unstoppable force. The chase had just become personal. It was no longer about a runaway girl. It was about dominance. About two old wolves circling each other, the ghosts of Widow's Creek hovering between them. Finally, Vane broke the silence with a laugh. But this time, the humor was gone completely. It was a cold, sharp, brutal sound. The sound of a man whose patience had just snapped. "Very well, Mr. Stone," he hissed, the honorific dripping with mockery. "You can have your little charade. For now." He turned, his duster swirling around him, and walked to the door. He paused in the frame, turning his head to look back, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "But know this. The desert is a hard place for a marriage to survive. Things have a way of withering out here. Enjoy your honeymoon, Jedediah." He shot one last, possessive glance at Nayati on the cot. "It will be a short one." And then he was gone, mounting his horse and riding away, not with the haste of a defeated man, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a predator who knows it's only a matter of time. Jed stood frozen, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him hollow and trembling. He had won the battle, but he knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach that he had just started a war he could not possibly win. That bluff was as bold as they come. Will it work? Type number 3, and tell me if you think Vane bought the lie. This tense standoff is just the beginning, and you won't want to miss how this high-stakes poker game plays out. The silence Vane left behind was worse than his threats. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from bluff and consequence. Jed stood by the door for a long time after the black stallion had become a speck on the horizon, the desert swallowing it whole. He felt the phantom weight of Vane's presence, a greasy stain on the air in his cabin. He had bought time, but he'd paid for it with a lie so colossal it had a gravity of its own. Wife. The word echoed in the brittle quiet. He hadn't just built a wall, he'd thrown a match into a powder keg and was now standing on the lid. Days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's relentless journey across the sky. The tension in the cabin was a living thing. It wasn't the sharp, panicked fear of an ambush anymore. It was something deeper, heavier. It was the slow, grinding pressure of a reckoning that was coming as surely as the tide. Jed worked, his movements economical and grim. He patched the fence, checked his water barrels, cleaned his weapons. But his focus was always split, one ear permanently tuned to the desert, listening for the return of those hoofbeats. He and the girl, his wife, existed in a state of suspended conflict. They barely spoke. There were no words for their situation. He would leave a plate of food for her on the small wooden table. She would eat, her movements still weak but growing surer every day. When he returned, the plate would be clean, a silent transaction. He would watch her sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking. He saw the way she tested her own weight, the way she stretched her wounded arm, her face a mask of stoic pain. He saw the strength flowing back into her, not like a gentle stream, but like a river reclaiming its dry bed. One afternoon, he came back inside to find her standing. She wasn't leaning on anything. She stood straight and proud in the center of the cabin, her gaze level and direct. The fever had burned away any remaining softness, leaving her features sharp and defined, like a carving from desert rock. The look in her eyes had changed. The desperate fire was still there, but it was banked now, controlled. It was the look of a hunter, not the hunted. She held up a hand, a gesture for him to stop. Then, with a deliberate motion, she knelt. She took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the cold fire pit. On the dusty floorboards of his cabin, she began to draw. Her lines were not hesitant or crude. They were swift, certain, and economical. She wasn't sketching, she was mapping. Jed watched, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. She drew the shape of his ranch, a small, lopsided square. She drew the well. Then her fingers moved outward, tracing the faint outline of the jagged hills to the east. She looked up at him, her dark eyes pinning him in place, ensuring he was paying attention. She drew a winding path leading into the hills, a path that narrowed, the lines growing closer and closer together until they were nearly touching. A canyon. She tapped a finger on the narrowest point of the canyon. Then she looked at him and spoke, her voice raspy from disuse, the English words broken but clear, each one a carefully chosen stone. "Vain, man," she said, her voice low and intense. "He come." It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Jed just nodded. "I know." She pointed again to the narrow pass on her floor map. She looked up at the ceiling, then made a sharp downward motion with her hands, her fingers spread wide. "Mountain," she whispered, the word sounding foreign on her tongue. She repeated the gesture, "Fall, down." The meaning hit Jed like a physical blow. It wasn't just a canyon, it was a trap, a natural deadfall. He looked from the crude map on the floor to her face. She knew this land. She knew its secrets, its teeth. The knowledge was in her bones, passed down through generations who had survived here, not with forts and rifles, but with an understanding of the earth itself. He looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see a helpless victim he had saved out of some misguided sense of duty. He didn't see a wife he had invented to protect himself. He saw a soldier, a strategist, a woman who had been stripped of her home, her people, and her freedom, but whose spirit remained an unbreachable fortress. He had offered her a shield of paper. She was offering him a sword made of stone. A grim smile touched Jed's lips for the first time in what felt like a decade. It wasn't a smile of humor, but of bitter irony. He had thought he was her only hope. He was beginning to realize she might be his. "How?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Nayati stood up. She walked to the small pouch of seeds that she now wore constantly, a talisman against the encroaching darkness. She touched it gently, a gesture of reverence. "My people, vain kill." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, a simple statement of fact. "I do not run, I fight." She pointed from the map to Jed, then back to herself. An unmistakable gesture. "You and me." The tension in the cabin had transformed. It was no longer the suffocating dread of waiting for death. It was now the sharp, electric hum of a plan. A desperate, insane, suicidal plan. They had no army. They had no allies. They had one rifle, a handful of bullets, an aging horse, and a map drawn in charcoal on a dirt floor. They had their wits, their courage, and a shared, bone-deep desperation. Jed looked into Nayati's eyes, and he saw his own resolve reflected there. It was the look of two people standing at the edge of a cliff who had decided that rather than being pushed off, they would choose to jump. He nodded once, a sharp, final gesture. The alliance was sealed. There was no turning back now. They have a plan, but it's a desperate one. Can two people truly stand against a man like Vane? Type number 4 in the comments if you think they have a fighting chance. If you're on the edge of your seat, give this video a like and share it. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you don't miss the transformation that happens next. You're about to see what a cornered warrior is truly capable of." The shift was as subtle and profound as the desert changing color at sunset. It wasn't a single event, but a gradual reclaiming of self. Nayati, the broken girl Jed had carried across his threshold, was gone. Day by day, she was buried and reborn. In her place stood a woman forged in the crucible of loss, her spirit annealed to the hardness of desert steel. The hunted had become the huntress, and the cramped, dusty cabin was now her war room. Her movements lost their last traces of weakness. Where before she had limped, she now moved with a silent, fluid grace, a purpose humming in every step. She ate not like a starving refugee anymore, but like a soldier fueling for a long march, each bite a deliberate act of building strength. She would take the strips of jerky and hardtack Jed offered with a solemn nod, her eyes thanking him with a gravity that words could never capture. She spent hours by the single window, not watching the horizon with the cowering fear of a cornered animal, but studying it with the keen, analytical eye of a general surveying the battlefield. She was reading the land, noting the way the shadows fell at different times of day, the direction of the prevailing winds, the flight patterns of the hawks that circled high above. Jed would watch her, fascinated. She wasn't just looking, she was listening to its secrets, a language he had lived in for 8 years, but had never truly learned to speak. One evening, as the shadows grew long and painted the desert in hues of blood and bruised purple, she beckoned Jed to the center of the room. The charcoal map was still there, a sacred, smudged text on the floorboards. She knelt beside it, her posture straight, regal. This time, she didn't just point. She began to speak, and her voice was a revelation. The raspy, broken whisper was gone. In its place was a low, resonant tone, imbued with a strength that seemed to come from the very earth beneath them. Her English was still a fractured collection of stones, but she laid them out with such precision and intensity that Jed understood every shade of meaning. She picked up the small leather pouch from around her neck. She didn't clutch it. She held it in her open palm as if it were a living, beating heart. "This," she began, her eyes locking onto his, demanding his full attention. "Not food." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the quiet room. "Is soul. Is tomorrow." With a mixture of stark words and evocative gestures, she painted a picture of what Vane had done. It was a story told in shadows and fire. He hadn't just raided her village for supplies or sport. It had been an extermination, a cold, calculated erasure of her people, the Sheeni, the Painted Rock clan. They were a small, peaceful tribe, she explained, who knew the secrets of making the arid land bloom. They weren't warriors. They were growers, listeners, tenders of the earth. Vane had heard stories of their resilience, of their almost magical ability to cultivate life where other men saw only death. And in his black, barren heart, he couldn't abide it. It was a testament to a power he couldn't control, so he had to destroy it. He hadn't just killed the people, he had burned the fields, poisoned the wells, and systematically destroyed their seed vaults. He had stolen their future. All except this one last pouch, which she had saved from the flames. He killed people, she said, her voice tight, not with tears, but with a grief so profound it had hardened into diamond. Now, he killed memory. No seeds, no Sheeni. We are dust. Jed listened, his face a mask of stone, but inside, something was shifting. The abstract, suffocating weight of his guilt over Widow's Creek was crystallizing into a sharp, specific rage. Vane wasn't just a murderer, he was a vandal of the soul. A man who destroyed beautiful things simply for the sake of watching them break. He wasn't just a wolf, he was a plague. For the first time, Jed's fight wasn't about his own redemption. It was about defiance. He was no longer just protecting a girl, he was standing guard over the last ember of a dying fire. Nayati's finger returned to the map, to the narrow, treacherous canyon she called Snake's Tooth Pass. She began to describe it not as a landmark, but as a living entity. She spoke of the high, sheer walls that blocked out the sun, even at noon, making the air within cold and dead. She described the loose, treacherous shale that covered the slopes, a carpet of tiny knives that would betray any foothold. She knew every curve, every outcrop. Then she described a specific rock formation, high on the eastern rim. A massive, precariously balanced pillar of sandstone she called the Sleeping Giant. For generations, it had been a place of reverence for her people, a natural monument where they prayed for rain and good harvests. Now, it would be a tombstone. One man, she explained, her finger tracing a difficult, almost vertical path up the canyon wall to a high ledge. One good push. She used a piece of charcoal to show how a single, well-placed crowbar or a heavy log could dislodge a keystone at the giant's base, triggering a cascade. Giant, wake up. The plan was terrifying in its simplicity. She wasn't just giving him a strategy. She was entrusting him with the sacred geography of her ancestors. She was turning a place of worship into a weapon of vengeance. It was a profound sacrifice, and Jed understood the cost. This wasn't just about survival anymore. For her, this was about justice. A final, terrible act of defiance to ensure that the man who had erased her people from the world would himself be erased by it. He looked at the pouch of seeds, then at the map on the floor, then at her. Her face, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, was no longer that of a frightened girl. It was the face of a queen defending the ashes of her kingdom, the face of a priestess prepared to desecrate her own temple to smite the unbeliever. Jed finally realized the profound truth of their situation. He had spent 8 years running from his own past, haunted by the wolf he used to be. Nayati was running toward the future, carrying the soul of her people on her shoulders. He had thought his role was to be the shield, the gunman, the brute force. He saw now that he was just a tool. The mind, the heart, the soul of this desperate gambit was hers. She was the weapon. He was just the hand chosen to wield it. "He will come for you," Jed said, his voice quiet, stating a fact. "He will not expect you to be waiting for him." Nayati looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something new passed between them. It wasn't gratitude or fear. It was a shared understanding. The unspoken bond between two soldiers on the eve of a battle they both knew they might not survive. Two ghosts, one from the past and one from the future, making a stand in the unforgiving present. "We wait," she said, her voice steady as a rock, "and the mountain will speak for our dead." The hunted has become the huntress, and the stage is set for a deadly confrontation. Type number 5 to show you're ready for the showdown. She has the plan, but Jed has to execute it. Let's follow them as they walk into the lion's den. There was no grand farewell to the cabin. In the blue-gray light of a false dawn, they simply walked away from it. Jed didn't look back. The cabin wasn't a home. It was a cage of memories, and he was finally leaving the door open. They left everything behind but the essentials. One rifle, a canteen of water each, a length of sturdy rope, and the heavy iron crowbar from Jed's small smithy. And around Nayati's neck, beneath her tunic, lay the pouch of seeds. It was the only thing that truly mattered. They weren't running. This was a strategic retreat, a deliberate act of drawing the enemy onto their chosen ground. Vane expected them to flee west, toward the faint promise of civilization. Instead, guided by Nayati, they headed east, deeper into the jagged, broken teeth of the hills. The game had changed. They were no longer the prey. They were the bait, and the hook was a canyon named Snake's Tooth Pass. For 2 days, they moved through the harsh landscape. Nayati was transformed. She was no longer a refugee in his world. He was a foreigner in hers. She moved through the rocks and ravines with a certainty that was breathtaking. She taught him how to walk without leaving a clear trail, how to use the terrain to mask their movements, how to read the subtle signs of the desert. She was a ghost in her own land, and Jed, under her tutelage, became a ghost's shadow. They knew Vane was coming. They could feel his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was a patient predator, but his arrogance was his weakness. He would believe they were running scared, getting sloppy, making mistakes. He would not, could not, conceive that they were leading him. On the third day, they reached the entrance to the pass. It was a narrow slit in the rock face, an ugly, jagged mouth that promised nothing but shadow and stone. The air grew colder as they entered, the sunlight choked off by the towering walls of rock that soared hundreds of feet above them. The silence here was different. It wasn't the open silence of the desert. It was a claustrophobic, dead silence, where every scuff of a boot, every dislodged pebble, echoed like a gunshot. This was the kill box. Jed looked up. High above, silhouetted against the sliver of blue sky, was the sleeping giant. It was a monstrous pillar of sandstone, a geological freak that seemed to defy gravity, clinging to the canyon rim by a thread. It looked solid, eternal, but Nayati had assured him its foundation was rotten, eroded by 1,000 years of wind and rain. It was waiting for a push. Their moment of quiet planning was over. It was time to separate. Nayati looked at Jed, her dark eyes holding his. There was no fear in them. There was only a cold, hard clarity. She handed him a small bundle of dried herbs from a pouch at her belt. "For grip," she said simply. He nodded, rubbing the chalky substance on his hands. He checked the rope coiled over his shoulder, the heavy crowbar in his hand. He looked at the sheer rock face he had to climb to reach the ledge below the giant. It was a climb that would have been suicide for most men, but for a man who already considered himself dead, it was just another chore. "Be careful," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "He will not see me," she said, and with that she turned and melted into the shadows of the canyon floor, disappearing among the boulders with an unnerving speed. Her job was just as critical. She was the lure. She would draw Vane into the heart of the trap. Jed began to climb. It was brutal, punishing work. The rock face was steep and unforgiving, offering only the smallest cracks and ledges for handholds. The herbs Nayati had given him helped, but his muscles screamed in protest. The weight of the crowbar felt like an anchor trying to pull him back to the canyon floor. He didn't look down. He focused only on the next handhold, the next foothold, a slow, grueling ascent. The ghosts of Widow's Creek were climbing with him, their phantom hands trying to pull him down, whispering of failure. He gritted his teeth and pushed them away, focusing on the single burning image of Nayati's face, on the feel of the pouch of seeds, on the cold fury that had become his fuel. He reached the ledge just as the sun climbed to its zenith, a sliver of brilliant light directly overhead. He was exhausted, his hands raw and bleeding, his body trembling with exertion, but he was in position. From here, he had a perfect, godlike view of the canyon floor below. He could see the narrowest point of the pass, the kill zone, and he could see the base of the sleeping giant, a crumbling foundation of rock just a few feet from his ledge. He wedged the crowbar into a deep crack near a key support stone, testing its leverage. It was ready. All that was left was to wait. The silence stretched, and the waiting was its own form of torture. Doubt began to creep in. What if Vane didn't take the bait? What if he had circled around? What if something had happened to Nayati? Jed pushed the thoughts away, forcing himself to breathe, to listen, and then he heard it. The faint clatter of a horse's shoe on rock, echoing up the canyon walls. He peered over the ledge. At the far end of the pass, 3 riders appeared. Vane was in the lead, his black duster a stark slash against the pale rock. He was flanked by 2 hired guns, rough-looking men with rifles held ready. They were moving slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning the canyon walls. Jed's heart pounded against his ribs. He flattened himself against the rock, becoming part of the stone, willing himself invisible. He watched as Vane and his men moved deeper into the pass. He saw a flicker of movement on the canyon floor far below, near a massive boulder. It was Nayati. She darted out from behind the rock, fired a single arrow from a small bow he hadn't known she possessed, and then disappeared again. The arrow clattered harmlessly against the canyon wall near Vane's head, a deliberate provocation. It was the perfect taunt. Vane's men raised their rifles, but Vane laughed, a sound that echoed unnaturally in the confined space. "The little she-cat still has claws," he boomed. "Flush her out. I want her alive." His men spurred their horses forward, their caution forgotten in their eagerness to capture the prize. They rode directly into the narrowest part of the pass, right into the center of the kill zone. Vane followed, his face a mask of smug satisfaction. He had her trapped. He was exactly where they wanted him. Jed gripped the crowbar, his knuckles white. He looked down at the three figures below, so small and insignificant from his perch. He thought of the blacksmith's boy. He thought of the Sheeny, turned to dust. He looked at the sleeping giant, the ancient guardian of a murdered people. The time for waiting was over. The mountain was about to speak. The trap is sprung. Vane is right where they want him. Type number 6, if your heart is pounding right now. This is the moment of truth. If you're loving this intensity, smash that like button, share the suspense, and subscribe for the climax. You are not ready for what happens when the mountain speaks. Time seemed to slow down, the world narrowing to the 100-foot drop below and the iron bar in Jed's hands. He could see the scene unfolding with a preternatural clarity. Vane, laughing, confident, pointing his men forward. The two hired guns, spurred by greed and cruelty, riding carelessly into the heart of the trap. Nayati, a fleeting shadow on the canyon floor, the catalyst for their doom. Every detail was etched in his mind, sharp and bright against the backdrop of impending violence. He saw Vane rein in his horse directly below the sleeping giant, craning his neck to scan the higher ledges. For a heart-stopping second, Jed thought Vane had seen him. Their eyes almost met across the impossible distance, a flicker of recognition between two old wolves. But it was just a hunter's instinct. Vane saw nothing. He was blind, cocooned in an arrogance so complete it had become his shroud. Jed took a deep, shuddering breath. This was it. The debt of Widow's Creek was due. The ghosts were screaming for payment. He thought of the blacksmith's boy, of the homesteaders buried in unmarked graves, of a people turned to dust. He thought of Nayati, the last ember of a dying nation, and the pouch of seeds that represented a future Vane had tried to steal. He put his shoulder to the crowbar. The iron was cold and unyielding. He pushed, his muscles screaming, every fiber of his being focused on this single pivotal act. For a moment, nothing happened. The rock held, a stubborn monument to millennia of inertia. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. It won't move. Then, with a sound like the world cracking in two, it gave. A deep, grinding groan echoed through the canyon as the keystone shifted. It wasn't a clean break. It was a protest, the sound of the earth's bones breaking. The entire ledge beneath him trembled violently. Jed threw himself flat, clinging to the rock as dust and small pebbles rained down around him. Below, Vane and his men heard the sound. They looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The smug satisfaction on Vane's face vanished, replaced by pure, undiluted shock. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten to account for the wrath of the mountain itself. The sleeping giant stirred. The massive pillar of sandstone, which had stood silent for eons, began to lean. It moved with an impossible, terrifying slowness at first, a giant waking from a long slumber. A shower of rock and shale cascaded down, a prelude to the apocalypse to come. One of Vane's men screamed, a high, thin sound that was instantly swallowed by the growing roar. And then, with a final, cataclysmic groan, the giant fell. It wasn't just a rock slide, it was an avalanche. An entire cliff face peeling away, tons of sandstone and granite plunging into the narrow canyon. The roar was deafening, a physical force that vibrated through Jed's bones, shaking the very foundations of the world. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the sky was blotted out by a tidal wave of rock. The impact was absolute. The canyon floor erupted in a geyser of dust and pulverized stone. Malachi Vane and his men disappeared. They were not crushed, they were erased. Wiped from existence in a heartbeat, their screams, their horses, their very being, consumed by the mountain's fury. The avalanche didn't stop. It thundered down the length of the pass, a wave of destruction that scoured the canyon clean. The sound faded, replaced by the hiss of settling rock and a profound ringing silence. A thick, impenetrable cloud of dust filled the canyon from wall to wall, blocking out the sun, turning the world into a murky grey twilight. Jed lay on the ledge, his body trembling, his ears ringing. He was covered in a fine layer of grit, the taste of ancient stone on his tongue. He had done it. He had pulled the trigger on a gun made of rock and gravity. Slowly, carefully, he began the long, treacherous climb down. His body was numb, moving on autopilot. He didn't know what he would find below. He didn't know if Nayati had made it clear. The dust was so thick he could barely see his own hands in front of his face. He called her name, his voice a raw croak. Nayati. There was no answer but the soft whisper of the settling dust. He reached the canyon floor, his boots sinking into a fresh layer of powdered rock. The landscape was unrecognizable. Where there had been a clear path, there was now a mountain of rubble, a newly made tomb that stretched for 100 yards. There was no sign of Vane, his men, or their horses. Nothing, just stone and silence. Jed pushed forward, his heart a cold lump of dread in his chest. Nayati. He stumbled through the choking gloom, his eyes streaming. And then he saw her. She was leaning against the far canyon wall, just beyond the edge of the rockfall. She was covered in dust, a ghostly figure in the grey light, but she was alive. She was unharmed. She had been close enough to taunt, but swift enough to escape. She was watching the tomb of her enemy, her face impassive. As Jed approached, she turned her gaze to him. He was expecting to see triumph in her eyes, or vengeance, or even fear. But there was none of that. What he saw was a quiet, profound respect, acknowledgement, two survivors at the end of the world. From the dust-choked shadows behind the rockslide, a new sound emerged, a low moan. It wasn't from the rubble. It was from a small hidden alcove in the canyon wall that the avalanche had revealed. Jed and Nayati exchanged a look. Jed unholstered his pistol, his instincts screaming that it wasn't over. They moved toward the sound together. In the alcove, huddled in the darkness, were three figures. Two women and a young boy, all Apache, bound with ropes, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. They were Vane's other strays, prisoners he had been taking back to sell. Jed stared at them, and the final piece of his shattered soul clicked into place. He hadn't just avenged the dead of Widow's Creek, he had saved the living. He cut their ropes with his knife, and the women began to weep, quiet, gasping sobs of relief. He had not only buried his enemy, he had buried his past. Under tons of Arizona rock lay the ghost of Malachi Vane, and with him the ghost of Jedediah Stone's failure. He looked at Nayati, who was speaking softly to the freed captives in their own tongue, her voice a balm on their terror. In her eyes, he saw not a reflection of his own violent past, but the faint, flickering light of a possible future. The weight he had carried for 8 years was finally, blessedly, gone. Vengeance has been served, and the past has been buried under a mountain of stone. Type number 7. Inch the comments to acknowledge that epic moment of justice. The battle is over, but the journey isn't. What comes next, after the dust settles? Let's find out. Dawn broke over a world that had been unmade and remade in violence. The light that spilled into Snake's Tooth Pass was soft and clean, washing the grey dust from the air, revealing the raw, brutal beauty of the canyon's new scar. The air smelled of fractured stone and the faint, clean scent of rain on dry earth. It was the smell of a fresh start. They led the 3 survivors out of the canyon, a small, ragged procession of ghosts, returning to the world of the living. Jed had given his horse Glory to the 2 women, while the young boy, whose name was Kale, walked beside Nayati. his hand clutching a fold of her tunic, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had dissolved into chaos. They returned to Jed's cabin, but it felt different now. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the quiet murmurs of human presence. The ghosts had been exorcised. It was no longer a tomb, it was just a shelter, a temporary way station on a longer journey. For 2 days, they rested. Jed shared his meager supplies without a second thought. He watched Nayati as she tended to the others. She wasn't just a warrior or a survivor anymore. She was a leader. She spoke to them with a quiet authority, her words a mixture of comfort and strength. She was the living embodiment of their people's resilience, and they drew hope from her as plants draw water from a hidden spring. On the 3rd morning, as Jed stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the sky, Nayati came to stand beside him. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the world wake up. "They will go south," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "To the Mescalero. They will find family there." Jed nodded. "And you?" She turned to him, her dark eyes clear and steady. The fire was still there, but it was a different kind of fire now. Not the desperate flame of survival, but the warm, enduring glow of purpose. "My journey is north," she said. She touched the leather pouch at her neck. "The seeds, they need good earth. A new place, a place to begin again." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. "What about you, Jedediah Stone? Your enemy is dead. Your ghosts are buried. What now?" He could stay. He could rebuild his quiet life, find the peace he had craved for so long. The thought was tempting. The silence was calling to him, a siren song of solitude and safety. But when he looked at the horizon, he no longer saw an empty expanse to hide in. He saw a road, an open possibility. He thought of the man he had been, hiding from the world, slowly turning to dust in his self-imposed prison. And he thought of the man he had become in the last few days, a man who had climbed a cliff, fought a devil, and stood beside a queen as she reclaimed her future. Going back to the silence now would feel like a different kind of death. "The north gets cold," he said, his voice a low rumble. A lone traveler could use a good rifle to watch their back. Nayati's expression didn't change, but he saw a new light dawn in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that went deeper than words. She didn't offer thanks or surprise. She simply accepted it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Two solitary souls, forged into something new by shared fire, continuing the journey together. "The journey is long," she stated, a simple fact. "I've got time," Jed replied. Their departure was as quiet as their alliance had been. They gave the remaining supplies and glory to the 2 women and the boy, pointing them south with a hand-drawn map and a solemn farewell. Then Jed saddled the one remaining horse, Vane's black stallion, a magnificent, powerful beast he'd found wandering, riderless, at the mouth of the canyon. A final spoil of war. The story closes on them riding out, not into the sunset, but into the broad, unforgiving light of morning. Jed on the black stallion, his rifle resting easy in its scabbard, his face turned toward the horizon. Nayati walked beside the horse, her stride long and sure, her gaze fixed on the distant northern mountains. She preferred to feel the earth beneath her feet. They weren't lovers, they weren't family, they were something more primal, comrades, survivors, partners in a shared destiny. A lonely cowboy who had found his soul by giving it away, and a warrior queen who carried the future of her people in a small leather pouch. They rode north, 2 small figures against a vast landscape. They didn't know what they would find. There were no guarantees of safety, no promises of a happy ending. The West was still a wild, untamed place that devoured hope and spat out bones, but they were not just running from a past anymore. They were riding toward a purpose. They carried more than just seeds. They carried a legacy of resilience, a testament to courage, and a quiet promise that even in the harshest wilderness, after the most brutal of storms, something new could, and would, find a way to grow. A new journey begins. They ride north, not as survivors, but as founders of a new future. Type number 8, to honor their path forward. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because we have so many more tales of courage, conflict, and redemption waiting for you right here on Wild West Tales. Click on the video on your screen now for another story you won't soon forget. There are stories that entertain you, and then there are stories that get under your skin. They find a crack in the armor you've built around yourself, and they settle deep inside, not like a splinter, but like a seed. The tale of Jedediah Stone and the Apache girl, Nayati, is one of those seeds. On the surface, it's a classic Western, a gritty, violent, and beautiful story of survival against impossible odds. But if you sit with it, if you let the dust settle, you realize it's not really about gunfights or canyons. It's about the ghosts we carry, the walls we build, and the terrifying, redemptive power of letting someone else in. For me, the heart of this entire story beats in that dusty, silent cabin where Jed first confronts his own solitude. For 8 years, he wasn't just living alone, he was actively hiding from life. His ranch wasn't a home, it was a fortress he'd built to keep his past locked out. And isn't that something we all do, in our own way? We all have a widow's creek, a moment of failure, a profound loss, a deep regret. A place in our minds where the screams of what we could have done, or should have done, still echo, and so we build walls. We tell ourselves that solitude is peace, that detachment is strength. We convince ourselves it's safer to feel nothing than to risk feeling pain again. Jed's fortress was made of wood and stone, but ours are often made of cynicism, of busyness, of keeping everyone at a careful, manageable distance. We curate a life that's safe, predictable, and quiet. But quiet isn't the same as peace. It's often just the sound of a soul slowly suffocating. Then Nayati collapses on his doorstep. Trouble, chaos, a life or death problem that he didn't ask for, and certainly didn't want. And his first instinct, the one honed by 8 years of survival, is to turn away. It's the smart play, the safe play. Every logical part of his brain is screaming at him to close the door, to let the desert solve its own problems. And this is a moment I think we all recognize. It's the friend calling with a problem when you're already overwhelmed. It's the opportunity that feels too risky, too big. It's the plea for help that threatens the comfortable, quiet fortress we've built. And it is so easy to say no, to justify our inaction, to protect our peace. But the story teaches us that true peace isn't found in the absence of conflict. It's found in the discovery of purpose. Jed's decision to help her wasn't logical. It was a rebellion of the soul. It was the last, flickering ember of the man he used to be, refusing to be extinguished. He chooses to act, not because he is brave or noble, but because the alternative, letting her die and living with that choice, is a death of a different kind. It's the moment he stops simply surviving and starts, just maybe, living again. And that leads to the story's most powerful transformation, the shift from me to we. When Jed stands up to Malachi Vane with that audacious lie, "She's my wife," he's no longer just fighting for himself. For the first time in years, he's fighting for someone else. That lie, as flimsy as it was, created a bond. It created a we where before there was only an I. And in that we, both of them found a strength they didn't possess alone. This is where the story truly speaks to our lives. We are told constantly that success is about individual achievement, about being self-made, about pulling ourselves up by our own bootstraps. But Jed's story argues otherwise. His individual strength had only led him to a life of hollow solitude. His real power, his path to redemption, only appeared when he allowed his fate to become entangled with Nayati's. He had the physical strength, the knowledge of his enemy. She had the strategic mind, the spiritual resilience, the knowledge of the land. Separately, they were both dead. Together, they were an army. It teaches a profound lesson about vulnerability. Nayati, in sharing the sacred story of her people's seeds, entrusts him with her entire legacy. Jed, in defending her, exposes himself to the very monster he'd spent his life running from. Their alliance wasn't built on trust. It was built on shared desperation and a mutual recognition of the warrior spirit in each other. They found strength not by hiding their weaknesses, but by laying them bare and realizing that one person's weakness could be covered by the other's strength. And that climax, the avalanche, it's more than just a spectacular end for a villain. It's a metaphor for what has to happen inside of us. To truly move on, sometimes you have to bury the past. Not ignore it, not pretend it didn't happen, but bury it. Jed didn't just kill Vayne, he buried the ghost of his own failure. The avalanche was a final, violent, and necessary act of closing a chapter. It was a declaration that the past would no longer have power over his present. And in the silence that followed, he was finally free, not just from Vayne, but from himself. The resolution of this story is what makes it timeless. It isn't a happily ever after. They don't get married, settle down, and build a new ranch. That would be too easy, too neat. Instead, their individual purposes merge into a single shared journey. His need for redemption becomes her need to rebuild. They are two broken pieces that don't magically become whole, but who fit together to create something new and purposeful. They are riding north, not because they know what's there, but because they know they have to keep moving forward together. So, what do we take from this? What's the lesson we can apply when we walk away from the campfire? For me, it's this. Look at the walls you've built around your life. Ask yourself if they are protecting you, or if they are imprisoning you. True strength isn't found in unbreakable solitude. It's found in the courage to be vulnerable, to connect, to form an alliance with another soul. Your purpose in life may not arrive as a clear-cut mission. Sometimes it shows up bleeding on your doorstep. It looks like trouble. It feels like a burden. But it might just be the thing that saves you from the ghost of who you used to be. Don't be afraid to answer the door. Don't let your past bury your future. You can't change what happened at your widow's creek, but you can decide what you do the next time someone needs you. You can choose to be the person who walks away to protect their quiet, or you can be the person who says, "Not on my watch." That choice, that single act of stepping into someone else's fight, might just be the beginning of your own redemption. It might be the moment you finally stop running. Think about the we in your life. Who are the people you are fighting alongside? And if you feel like you're fighting alone, maybe it's time to find your Nayati or be a Jed for someone else. Because as this story so powerfully reminds us, sometimes the only way to save yourself is to get lost in the act of saving someone else. The journey north is long, and it's better not to travel it alone. So, find your fellow traveler, share your map, and start walking toward the horizon together. That's how you build a future from the ashes of the past.